Hey there, let's go through all the Borg episodes in classic Star Trek. Let's start from the beginning and go to the end. So, first off, if we rewind back to TOS and the TOS films, there are no Borg, though there are various episodes that explore related concepts, such as the zombie-like loss of individuality in Return of the Archons. Then when we go on to TNG Season 1, there's still no Borg, though the episode Conspiracy definitely has some similar concepts going on. And in the season finale, The Neutral Zone suggests that there may be some powerful new enemy destroying Federation outposts near the Neutral Zone. Later on, there was a point in development when the writers actually thought about making some kind of connection between those conspiracy creatures and the Borg, but they decided against it. But anyway, then in TNG Season 2, Episode 16, the Borg were finally introduced in the episode Q Who. And from that point on, I guess we just can't get enough of these nightmarish monstrosities. And they ended up becoming a fan favorite. And over the years, these big bad robo-zombies have gotten more than 15 focused episodes, mostly in TNG and Voyager. So if we want, we can group the Borg episodes into 5 categories. Category 1, we've got TNG episodes. There are 4 proper Borg episodes, including 2 two-part episodes from 1989 to 1993. There are also a couple more episodes that discuss the Borg less directly. Category 2, we've got the one-of-a-kind classic film First Contact from 1996 and its 2003 successor within Star Trek Enterprise, which is the Enterprise episode Regeneration. Category 3, we've got the great swath of Borg episodes in Star Trek Voyager from 1997 through 2001, totaling 9 or 10 or so, depending which ones you count. This includes a number of two-part episodes as well. And the reason the number is fuzzy, 9 or 10 or whatever, is because once 7 of 9 joins the crew in Season 4, there's a sense in which anytime 7 says anything interesting, we could call it a Borg episode. So I'm just counting the ones that feel to me like Borg episodes more properly. And then category number 4, in the modern era, we've got Star Trek Picard, which ran from 2020 through 2023, which used the Borg as a backdrop in season 1, and then used the Borg for core story elements in seasons 2 and 3. And then category 5, we've got what I'm just calling other. So there's a Borg-focused episode in Star Trek Prodigy in 2022, and according to Memory Alpha, there are 6 episodes of Lower Decks that involve the Borg in some way. All right, so let's dig on in. So for TNG, I listed 4 proper Borg episodes and then 2 important references in addition to those. The first important reference was, like I said, in TNG Season 1, the finale, episode 26, The Neutral Zone. So in that episode, the B plot, or you could call it the A plot, depending how you look at it, involves the Enterprise being sent to investigate Federation outposts at the edge of the Neutral Zone, who Starfleet has lost contact with. The Enterprise arrives to find them completely obliterated. And when they managed to open communication with the Romulans claim they had nothing to do with it, and their outposts were obliterated as well. Now, if you remember, this was the episode where the A plot for the episode was this completely unrelated story about the discovery of these 3 cryogenically frozen humans from the late 20th century, who the Enterprise discovers and then thaws them out. So that's the episode. Anyway, so after that, the next 15 episodes are completely silent about these mysterious invaders destroying outposts near the neutral zone, who apparently, when the neutral zone was written, the writers originally intended these creatures would have been some kind of insectoids. But anyway, then we get season 2, episode 16, Q Who. In this episode, Q is offended that Picard refuses to accept him into the crew like he requested. Picard insists they don't need his help as they go flying into the unknown every week. So Q, in order to make a point about how unprepared humans are for the great unknown, flings the Enterprise 7,000 light years away where they meet their first Borg cube. And one thing leads to another, and by the end of the episode, the Enterprise is desperately fleeing, trying to get away from these monsters hot on their tail, until finally, in a moment of desperation, Picard asks Q for help. And Q sends them back where they came from, and we live happily ever after. So in that episode, we get to see this early version of the Borg that the writers initially came up with, in which the Borg don't seem interested in assimilating people, but only technology. And it is assumed as well that the Borg reproduce biologically. Of course, later episodes are going to retcon these assumptions big time. And when you go back and watch this episode, you can watch it with those later developments in mind, and it still works for the most part. One of the few exceptions to that would probably be when Q makes a comment that the Borg aren't interested in people, but only in technology. And that's difficult to wipe out because you would think Q would know. You know, that the Starfleet people are just speculating, but you would think Q would know. But anyway, other than that, for the most part, you can kind of retcon it in your mind and say this is them not quite knowing what's actually happening when they slice off that section of the hull. Oh, they actually wanted to take the people in it and assimilate them too, you know. But anyway, coming away from Q Who, the main feeling you come away with about the Borg is that they are unstoppable, always adapting, and they are more powerful, more threatening than anything Starfleet has ever met before. And of course, they're coming. The Enterprise didn't stand a chance against that cube without Q's help. And in that sense, the Borg are the ultimate adversary and they are unstoppable. Well, the next appearance of the Borg comes in season 3, episode 26, The Best of Both Worlds, which is the season finale and one of the most recognized and talked about episodes in all of TNG. In this episode, the Borg have begun encroaching into Federation space. But things get really interesting when the Borg kidnap Captain Picard and take him to their cube. And before we know it, it seems that, as Worf puts it, Captain Picard is a Borg. And this is also the episode where we see the famous Battle of Wolf 359 that in later Star Trek ends up getting referenced quite a bit. This battle is when Starfleet has amassed their fleet together to try to make this stand at this Wolf 359 place. But the Borg, when they show up, armed with the tactical knowledge that they have gained from Picard, or from Locutus of Borg, as he's now called, basically wipe out the fleet. So that's the incident that in the pilot episode of DS9, that's the incident that Sisko is remembering so painfully when his ship was destroyed and his wife Jennifer died down in their quarters during that battle. Anyway, so in this episode, Best of Both Worlds, the crew of the Enterprise managed to find Picard and get him back via some sci-fi shenanigans. And they are then able to tap into his link with the Borg Collective and use that to send the regenerate signal. So all the drones on the cube go into regeneration mode, which gives the Enterprise the moment that it needs to destroy the cube. And then after that, Crusher manages to de-Borgify the captain, and life goes back to normal. Sort of. So this episode was really our introduction to the concept of assimilation. And if I remember right, it seems like they never actually said that assimilation was something that the Borg do normally, just that that's what they did to Picard. And then it's kind of up to your imagination whether the Borg have ever done that to anyone else before or not. But of course, later on, it becomes quite well established that the Borg assimilate people all the time. That's what they do. Locutus was only unique in regard to the special role that they wanted him to play once he was assimilated.
Captain, it's been 5 hours since we started our away mission. There are no signs of any survivors anywhere. Except for the ones that are being assimilated.
And then next up, the very next episode, this is one I'm listing as an honorable mention, the episode Family. While this isn't a Borg episode per se, it's important for two reasons. First, because the premise is that Picard is going to Earth on vacation pretty much to recover from what happened in the last episode with the Borg. And then second, near the end of the episode, Picard ends up breaking down emotionally and opening up to his abrasive brother about the horrifying trauma that he went through getting assimilated and how it has left him so broken and wounded inside. Some of the other plot threads throughout the story focus on the family theme, as suggested by the title of the episode. So we got Worf's relationship with his parents, Wesley getting to see a recording from his deceased father, and Picard's nephew Rene, whose father has different ambitions for him than he has for himself. I think pairing together the theme of parent-child relationships with the theme of the intrusive trauma of the Borg assimilation process, it's kind of an intriguing pairing, especially when we think about what the Borg Queen said to a little boy in the Voyager episode Unimatrix Zero. The Queen says that being assimilated is like having a lot of friends, except that you're all so close that you can hear one another's thoughts. In a way, we could say this episode in TNG, the episode Family, allows us kind of to juxtapose the kind of messy but respectful family connection that binds families together with parental love, and juxtapose that with the superimposing annihilation of the individual in which your selfhood is consumed by the unit, which is what the Borg is. In a way, we could say Picard's brother, Robert, is, without knowing it, kind of borrowing a line from the Borg by unwittingly trying to stamp out his son's interests and ambitions. This is in contrast to Worf's adoptive parents, who clearly love him passionately, but have long since allowed him to differentiate from them and follow his own path as an individual in such a way that when we end up seeing them together, we almost can't see the likeness between them, which is part of why Worf is embarrassed by them and yet loves them, because they are not him and he is not them, but they're bound together with parental love. Wesley, by contrast, loves his father and has become something of a carbon copy of his father, though he did this freely. And in contrast to all of these is the Borg, who stamp out your uniqueness and your essence as an individual, pressing you into a mold to not only say and do the same as those around you, but actually even to think exactly the same as those around you. Because you are not an individual. You are a member of the collective. You are a bland and valueless cog in the machine of the single-minded organic community that has its own will and agenda and cutthroat, merciless excuse for a soul, and which seeks to swallow up everyone and everything that gets too close. Star Trek Voyager ends up drawing extensively on something very similar with the Seven of Nine and Captain Janeway relationship arc, because Captain Janeway freed Seven from the collective and invited her instead into specifically a family. That's what they call it, the family of the crew of Voyager. And Seven, of course, initially didn't want this freedom. She didn't want individuality. She scorned the concept of family because it's inefficient, it's chaotic in comparison to the uniformity and cohesion of the Borg unit. But over time, she eventually comes to value the beauty of human relationships and of the human individual and the pro-social Starfleet values that compel Captain Janeway and the Federation, because love is not sameness. Family is not machinery. And the lifeless collective is not even similar to the kind of humanity that Janeway craved for Seven to recover. Anyway, getting back to our progression here. So the next Borg episode after Family was Season 5, Episode 23, I, Borg, another timeless classic and an extremely memorable Borg staple, which originally aired in May of 1992. In this episode, the crew of the Enterprise finds a survivor of a crashed Borg ship, a drone who calls himself Third of Five, or, later on, with the encouragement of Lieutenant LaForge, ends up calling himself Hugh. Early on, they start putting together a plan to use Hugh, or Third of Five, to carry a math virus back to the Borg collective and do as much damage as possible. But then as the story goes on, we begin to see little glimmers of personhood and individuality and humanity as this young person begins to respond to the people around him. And then it finally ends up where Guinan ends up meeting with him, and then Picard ends up meeting with him, and they both conclude, this is not a drone anymore. This is a person. This is an actual individual with personhood. So they decide to give him the freedom to choose whether he wants to stay with them or go back to the Borg, hoping that if he does go back to the Borg, his newfound sense of individuality could make an impact on the Borg collective. Hugh explains that he would so much rather stay with Geordi, because he developed a connection specifically with Geordi. But he knows the Borg are going to come looking for him, and that him staying would put everybody in danger. So he asks to be put back where they found him so the Borg can take him back. And that's what happens. And then down the road, this episode ended up forming the inspiration for a number of later episodes in later Star Trek. 3 in particular come to my mind. First off, the premise for the Seven of Nine character from Voyager is clearly a modified version of this premise. The biggest difference being the fact that Seven had been a drone for most of her life already. So by the time she actually got freed from the collective, she was extremely resistant and angry about being separated, and she demanded they send her back. So that added some interesting story variation. So that's the first one. The second one that comes to my mind is the episode Drone, also from Voyager, in which the spontaneously generated drone named One plays a very similar role to Hugh in terms of having this kind of childlike innocence about him as he wanders about the ship. And then the third that comes to my mind is the Voyager episode Child's Play, which focuses on a race that uses people to deliver viruses to the Borg through assimilation. And we'll get to each of these 3 episodes as we go through. All right, so next up in TNG, the final TNG episode to focus on the Borg is the 1993 Season 6 finale, the 2-part episode Descent. This is when the Enterprise meets a large group of Borg individuals led by Data's evil twin, Lore. They find out that these Borg are actually the after effect of Hugh's sense of individuality having seeped into the collective. And what happened was, after the chaos resulting from Hugh's influence, these affected drones were disconnected from the collective but not killed, and then eventually they fell under the sway of Lore. After the events of this episode, Lore ends up deactivated, and Hugh ends up becoming the leader of that group of Borg individuals. Well, not long after that, The Next Generation actually finishes with its finale, All Good Things. And I guess at that point, it probably looked a little bit like we aren't going to get to see the Borg anymore. But nothing could be further from the truth, because in 1996, we end up getting arguably the most compelling Star Trek film of all time, Star Trek First Contact, in which we come into the film with Starfleet locked in conflict with the Borg, and the Enterprise chases down a Borg sphere headed to Earth with the intent of opening a time portal to Earth's history in order to prevent the launch of the first warp ship and eliminate the Federation threat before it even begins. In the end, the crew is able to destroy the sphere and make sure Zefram Cochrane gets the Phoenix launched on schedule. But along the way, the Borg find their way onto the Enterprise and begin assimilating the ship bit by bit. Data ends up getting captured by the Queen, who tries to seduce him with emotion and flesh. But when push comes to shove in the final showdown with Picard, our hearts are stirred when Data's loyalty and love for the captain show through at the last minute when he turns the tables on the Queen and contemptuously declares, "Resistance is futile." So, First Contact, other than making the Borg more famous than they ever were before, First Contact also makes a number of various changes to the Star Trek world in relation to the Borg. So first off, the Borg get their new look with a much more intimidating design, especially a different kind of skin makeup. Secondly, we get the introduction of the Borg assimilation tubules, which in Voyager end up being the generic tool that the Borg use for just about everything, e.g. for hacking into Starfleet control terminals, whereas in TNG, the Borg tended to use these funny electric zapper bolts for the same kinds of things. And perhaps most notably and most controversially was the introduction of the Borg Queen, in order to give us a face for the Borg, so she can be the face of evil that Picard can face off against. She doesn't lead the Borg per se, she just gives order to chaos. And as Picard says in the film, yes, she was there all along, way back in Best of Both Worlds, back when Picard got assimilated. Well, anyway, since Voyager ended up introducing the Borg just a year later in 1997, it only makes sense that they'll get to take advantage of all the new makeup and story elements that First Contact introduced. So throughout Voyager, the Borg look exactly like the ones from First Contact, complete with assimilation tubules and the important role of the Queen, etc. But before we get to that, let's actually fast forward to 2003 real quick, because that's when we get the more proper follow-up to First Contact, which is the Enterprise episode, Season 2, Episode 23, Regeneration. In this episode, during the days of Captain Archer, a research team in the Arctic on Earth inadvertently thaws out some Borg that crash landed during the events of the First Contact film. These Borg tragically assimilate those researchers, and then they end up assimilating this ship and taking to the stars, requiring Archer's Enterprise to chase it down and eventually destroy it. So I list it here kind of out of order just because it's so closely connected with First Contact, and it doesn't end up relating that much with the rest of the saga, largely because this incident in the history of the Federation was logged away in the Starfleet archive and completely forgotten about by the time Picard and the gang met the Borg for the first time 2 centuries later in the events of the episode Q Who. All right, well, I guess we could say we're kind of at the midsection of our succession here, because like I said, definitely the majority of the Borg episodes in classic Star Trek belong to Star Trek Voyager, and in a big way, First Contact kind of serves as the big transition point between the old Borg and the new Borg in a way. So kind of really when we launch into Voyager, it kind of does feel like we're going into the noticeably distinct second half of the Borg saga, because they look so different and there are some dynamics that are different, etc. Over the years, Voyager has been criticized by fans for overusing the Borg. And when you look at the episode count of Borg episodes in Voyager versus in TNG, you can definitely see that there's definitely a tilted scale going on there. For myself, however, I don't find that this makes the Borg less interesting to me, but actually all the more interesting. In my mind, you can't overdo the Borg if you do the Borg well. And for myself, I don't find that Voyager makes the Borg less scary or less interesting than TNG, just scary and interesting in different ways. But that said, it does definitely go without saying that the Borg look and feel very different in, let's say, Unimatrix Zero than they do in, let's say, Q Who. And if I was really attached to the unique look and feel and story role that the Borg had in early TNG, then I would, I guess, probably be quite a bit less enthused with the later Voyager classics, if you want to call them that, like Unimatrix Zero and Dark Frontier, which have really done something quite different with the Borg.
Captain, you were right. These things are very comfortable. I could fall asleep standing up. Captain, before I get assimilated, I have one thing I wanted to ask.
Yes, and what is it?
Well, Captain, after I've been assimilated, feel free to like, subscribe, maybe make a comment or two.
All right, so for Voyager, I've listed 9 proper Borg episodes and 4 important references. But keep in mind, like I said, any 7 of 9 episode or any important comment or scene could be listed as a Borg reference, but that's obviously not what I'm going for here, so I'm just going to list some of the more key standouts. All right, so the first Borg scene in Voyager is season 3, episode 16, Blood Fever, which is that one bizarre episode where B'Elanna catches the Pon farr from Vorik. Yeah, that one. But if you skip over that episode on your rewatch through Voyager, then you will unfortunately also happen to be skipping over the first sighting of the Borg in Voyager, because at the very end of that episode, Chakotay tells the captain there's something on the planet she's going to want to see, so she beams down and he leads her over and pulls back some bushes to reveal the corpse of a Borg drone. And so ends the episode, in effect grabbing the viewer by the shoulders and shouting, "Come back next time! Come back next time!" And if you do, the very next episode is Unity, in which Chakotay makes an emergency shuttle landing on this one planet where there's this colony of crashed survivors who offer him shelter and provision. But over time, he discovers they are all ex-Borg who are connected to one another. They were disconnected from the collective when they crashed, and there was this storm, and they were disconnected from the collective, and they've lived on the planet as individuals ever since. They want his help to increase the power of their link to one another in order to diminish the infighting among themselves, which Janeway is strongly opposed to. In the end, they end up telepathically coercing him to help them, which he does. He goes into it, does what they want, which inadvertently results in the awakening of a dormant Borg cube. And then in the nick of time, those ex-Borg are able to send the message to cause that cube to self-destruct before it takes over Voyager. And then as the episode ends, Voyager heads off. The ex-Borg send Voyager their gratitude for their newfound unity. They're no longer fighting among themselves because of Chakotay's help. I mean, he was coerced, but, you know. And then meanwhile, as the episode ends, Chakotay and Janeway contemplate together the question of how long can moral goodness go on prevailing in a society where the collective grows in its power to coerce and control those within its influence. After that, we get the season 3 finale, the 2-part episode Scorpion. This is when Voyager really bumps into the Borg for the first solid time. But they also, at the same time, bump into the Borg's new arch-nemesis that the Borg lured out of fluidic space, which they call Species 8472. So Janeway, in a moment of inspiration, decides to strike a deal with the devil, as she calls it, contrary to Chakotay's advice. And they barter for safe passage through Borg space in return for their innovative technology that will help the Borg defeat Species 8472. 7 of 9, representing the Borg to negotiate with Janeway. She tricks Voyager into providing the technology prematurely and then proceeds to try to assimilate Voyager. Voyager puts into action its backup plan. They telepathically distract 7 while running a surge to take her out and overload her link to the collective. So, in the end, Voyager manages to get back on course for home, and they head back off. And in sickbay, they've got this unconscious 7 of 9 lying on that bio bed as the episode ends. And then there's several episodes while there's the extended 7 of 9 story, as she resists and fights back. She doesn't want to be part of the crew. She demands, "Send me back," etc. So I'm not going into that because I'm just doing the standout episodes. That's really the 7 of 9 story beginning the arc there. But anyway, next up we have season 4, episode 6, The Raven. This is when 7, who by this time has stopped trying to escape from Voyager, this is when she starts having flashbacks that she thinks are the Borg calling her back. She ends up overpowering the ship in order to follow this call, but it turns out that it wasn't the Borg calling her per se. It was a homing beacon left on the remains of her parents' ship where she had been assimilated. The ship is called the Raven. And this allows us our first solid glimpse through Seven's memories of the young Seven of Nine who was assimilated all those years ago in fear and terror. These memories that Seven has been all too willing to forget and stamp out of existence until now. Next up, we get Season 5, Episode 2, Drone. In this episode, a transporter accident results in some of Seven's nanoprobes intermixing with the Doctor's 29th century mobile emitter, and with a little bit of sudden Borg evolution, a fully functioning Borg drone has been grown from the ground up. Seven begins to develop a relationship with this new person who learns voraciously and agonizes over the existential angst of feeling that he was an accident and has no purpose. Meanwhile, the Borg pick up a signal and come to get him, and in a last moment of self-sacrifice and bravery, he beams over to their ship to destroy it. They are able to bring him back to sickbay in critical condition, but he refuses treatment because he considers himself a danger to the crew, and he considers himself someone who wasn't meant to be, and he dies tragically. Next up, we've got another honorable mention. This is Season 5, Episode 7, Infinite Regress. This is mostly more of a 7 of 9 episode than a Borg episode because it's the one all about Seven getting the weird Borg version of multiple personality. But the reason I listed this one here is because in the end, we find out that the reason this is happening is because of a nearby Borg vinculum, which some aliens have infected as a way of getting back against the Borg. So the episode ends up introducing some new elements of the universe of the Borg. There's this thing called the vinculum inside most Borg ships that helps bring order to chaos within the Borg collective. Now, incidentally, remember the central plexus, which comes up in later Voyager? What was its role? Oh yeah, it was supposed to bring order to chaos. Remember the Borg Queen? What was her role? Oh yeah, to bring order to chaos. Anybody noticing a pattern here? Well, next up, we have the two-part Season 5, Episode 15, Dark Frontier, which is also a two-part, in which Seven learns more about her parents' research on the Borg, because Voyager needs, a leg up to resist the Borg. But then, suddenly, the Borg Queen begins to magically appear in Seven's dreams, threatening to destroy Voyager if she doesn't return back to the collective willingly. Well, eventually, Seven ends up on board a Borg ship having this extended one-on-one with the Borg Queen, who is trying to bring her willingly back into the fold as an individual so that she can use her with all of her humanity at their disposal. After the Queen's manipulation of Seven does end up failing, Voyager is finally able to pull off a rescue with the help of Seven of Nine's insight gained through the connection she has with the Queen, and so they're able to get her back. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 2, Survival Instinct, which is when Seven meets 3 former Borg who are connected to one another but not to the collective. Over the course of the episode, we find out that back when Seven was still a Borg, she and these 3 had crashed on a planet, and all 4 were disconnected from the collective, and those 3 began to remember their old lives, and they wanted to remain individuals. But that concept terrified Seven of Nine. So she overpowered them and re-assimilated them to form a mini collective under her control. And they were then afterwards recovered by the Borg and returned to the full collective. So then in the present day, during this episode, it's discovered that the only way that we can separate these 3 from one another, now that they are once again ex-Borg, is by removing certain implants, which will result in them dying within a month. And ultimately, they choose to have the implants removed and to use the rest of their time as best they can as individuals. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 16, Collective. In this episode, an away team is taken captive by a Borg cube that they find out is actually run by 5 children. These children are the only survivors after the rest of the drones were killed by a pathogen, and then the maturation chambers containing these children released them prematurely. Over the course of the episode, Seven attempts to build a relationship with these Borg children, and then ultimately she's able to convince 4 of them to return with her to Voyager once it becomes clear that the Borg are not interested in returning for them. Then as the episode ends, these 4 end up basically joining the crew until they can be returned to their people, and Icheb ends up remaining part of the crew for the rest of the series. Our next honorable mention is season 6, episode 19, which is more of an Icheb story than a Borg story, but is very relevant for the bigger picture here, because this is when they find Icheb's parents and they return him to them, only to find out down the road that his parents plan to return him to the Borg as a living weapon. Because it turns out that Icheb was originally born as a genetically engineered weapon to fight against the Borg, and that's why the cube that he was on ended up being destroyed. So his parents put him in a shuttle and sent him back to the Borg again. Well, fortunately, Voyager is able to rescue him from that unmanned shuttle in the nick of time just before the Borg would have reached him. Well, then we have perhaps the most memorable, or maybe the second or third most memorable Borg episode in Voyager, which is Unimatrix Zero. I think the three top contenders would be Scorpion, Dark Frontier, and Unimatrix Zero. And then which one of those three comes to the top? That'd be a hard call there. But anyway, this is one of the most memorable, definitely. So this is season 6, the season 6 finale, in which we find out about a place, a virtual place, that a small number of Borg drones visit during regeneration, kind of like a dream, but it's a stable place, unlike a dream, and it's a place they share, unlike a dream. This is called Unimatrix Zero. It's a virtual world that these drones inhabit together as individuals, and which Seven was a part of before she was freed from the collective. They start trying to make contact with Seven because the collective has found out about Unimatrix Zero and has been seeking out and killing each of the participants one by one, seeing Unimatrix Zero as a blemish on the perfection of the Borg. In the end, once the Borg Queen gains additional information and threatens to use Unimatrix Zero to kill all the drones all at once, finally Voyager takes desperate measures and finds a way to destroy Unimatrix Zero from the inside, causing Seven and the others to lose their virtual haven, but also allowing some of those drones to wake up in the real world with their memories of that place and with their individuality, and in some cases try to take over the actual real life Borg ship that they're on. As Unimatrix Zero is being destroyed, there's this one beautiful moment when Seven rushes back into that imploding universe to say one last goodbye to her lover, who she will never see again. And then, while Voyager fights for its life against the Borg, another Borg sphere comes out of a transwarp conduit and comes to their aid, led by one of those renegades from Unimatrix Zero. Well, next up, for another honorable mention, we have Season 7, Episode 2, Imperfection, which once again is more of a Seven story. This is the one where Seven's cortical node is malfunctioning and needs to be replaced. The reason I list it is because Voyager heads over to a Borg debris field to find a replacement, which gives it the feel of being a Borg episode, at least for that little bit there. In the end, it turns out they can't use that node that they recovered from the debris field because that drone had been dead for too long. So Seven ends up getting a transplant from Icheb, despite her extended protest. And then last of all, we have the final episode of Star Trek Voyager, which is Season 7, Episode 25, Endgame. Admiral Janeway from the future time travels back to give Voyager some extra technology and extra information that will allow them to get back home via the Borg transwarp hub. When Captain Janeway argues against her future self, she says she'd rather sacrifice themselves and deal a crippling blow to the Borg by destroying that transwarp hub. After that, the two of them start working together to see if they can find some way to do both. In the end, Voyager does go through the hub as planned to get home, but Admiral Janeway from the future visits the Queen to get assimilated, and in so doing, deliver a neurolytic pathogen that infects the Borg right at their center, knocking out the Queen and dealing a crippling blow to the Borg. Meanwhile, Voyager comes home to fanfare, soaring in through the remains of the Borg ship they just blew up. And then Star Trek Voyager's over, and the fans sigh longingly because they had been longing for a more satisfying epilogue. But in the spirit of positivity, we admit that while we may not have gotten a satisfying epilogue, we did get to see a lot of Borg, and we got to spend our share of time in the eerie Unicomplex. So it was a fun ending as far as I'm concerned. Well, that's it. That's all the classic Star Trek episodes focused on the Borg. Borg stories are so cool, aren't they? And then in the modern era of Star Trek, we do have more follow-ups. In Star Trek Picard Season 1, the defeat of the Borg serves as a fascinating and satisfying background element, with much of the Soji story taking place on what they call the Artifact, which is a former Borg vessel being repurposed while people like Soji help the surviving drones to regain their individuality. Absolutely beautiful concept as far as I'm concerned, and honestly the most satisfying follow-up to Endgame that I could imagine them doing. In season 2, though, they decided to do something completely different. And with a little bit of time traveling hijinks and some cantankerous Q capers, we find an alternate reality version of the Borg Queen ending up in the present day on Earth, which ends up making for this really intriguing story in which the Borg Queen ends up getting into Jurati's head and ends up playing kind of the face of evil as this conniving temptress in this fascinating psychological she-devil kind of way. Now, the season ends in a kind of awkward way with this kind of unconvincing conversion story where the Borg Queen ends up kind of merging with Jurati and becoming good. And I'm not sure how well they did that. But up to that point, I think the way they handled that whole subplot for most of the season was really quite fascinating, some really exquisite storytelling. And then in season 3, they bring back the Borg one last time, go to finish off the Borg Queen for the final time, as well as doing this somewhat dubious plotline about the Borg taking over the whole Federation fleet magically all at once. But since that happened around the same time that they restored the old Enterprise D from the Space Museum, and then Picard had his final epic showdown with the new Queen, well, with all that other stuff, we don't necessarily need to complain too much about the more dubious parts of the story. And then last off, I mentioned I've got this little other box. So this includes Star Trek Prodigy Season 1, Episode 12, Let Sleeping Borg Lie, which involves a dormant Borg cube coming back to life. And then, according to Memory Alpha, there are 6 episodes of Lower Decks that feature the Borg to some extent or other. So that's that. Like I said, primarily these 4 categories, with the 2 most notable entries being TNG and Voyager, and with First Contact sitting between them kind of like the seam between 2 halves. Okay, kind of lopsided if you call them halves, but, And then Star Trek Picard just kind of building on those 3 traditions in some pretty intriguing ways, I think, tying everything together really nicely. So what about you? What's your favorite era for the Borg? And what's your favorite Borg story? For myself, I don't think I could pick one favorite Borg story. Now, definitely some that come to the top are definitely First Contact, which is my favorite Star Trek film, as well as Unimatrix Zero and Dark Frontier. But I kind of think I just like and love all Borg stories. They're just such a cream of the crop staple of the Star Trek saga. All right, well, that's that. Hope I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.
Oh, hey, do you know, is it true the captain's looking for yellow shirts to go on an away mission to visit the Borg? Ah, yes, I just came from the bridge. They will be looking for you. I heard your name specifically. Okay, well, here's the thing. I've got about 30 replicator rations saved up. But you and me, we get something going on here, okay?
We are the Borg.